the trio versus Harper Martini and Peony Estates. My name is Judge Handley. I will be presiding over this trial. Scoring judges, please remember to keep your video and audio turned off unless told differently by a tournament coordinator. Attorneys, will you please make appearances for the record?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Smith, and along with my co-counsel, Ms. B. Brawley, I'm Mr. Benjamin Wallace. Together, we'll be representing the plaintiff in today's case, the family of Ms. Genesis Petrillo. We'll be pursuing a claim of civil battery in today's trial. Would Your Honor like the defense to introduce themselves at this time?
Yes, please. Defense?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Jack Wood, and I'm joined today by my co-counsel, Ms. Lauren Forsythe.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
And Ms. Gabby Devin.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
And collectively, we represent the defendant, Ms. Harper Martini.
Thank you. Are there any preliminary matters that we need to take up before this trial can begin?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff does have a few preliminary matters. First, we just want to confirm you do have access to the court's bench book containing the complaint and answer, stipulations, case law, and items such as that.
I do. Thank you.
As well as the plaintiff would go ahead and motion to invoke Rule 615 and 603, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses in today's trial.
So granted, with the exception of party representatives.
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff does not have a party representative in today's case. And now just a few questions as to Your Honor's preferences, as we haven't had the opportunity to appear before you in this virtual format yet. When an objection is made, are we free to assume that it's heard outside of the presence of the jury?
You may.
When an objection is sustained, should we motion to strike or assume the offending testimony has already been stricken?
Please move to strike.
And prior to screen sharing any demonstratives or exhibits, should we ask for permission to screen share or assume that permission has been granted here?
You can assume permission has been granted for any exhibits that have already been entered into evidence. For anything else, please ask permission.
Yes, Your Honor. Now screen sharing the stipulations, if that's all right.
That's fine.
I'd just like to direct your attention to stipulation number 3. This simply states that in today's trial, both parties have agreed exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted for today's trial and are free for anyone to use at any time. With that, Your Honor, the plaintiff has no further matters to attend to before opening statements, and we're ready to proceed.
Defense, are there any additional pretrial matters to take up?
No, I believe that covers it, Your Honor. The defense is ready to proceed to opening statements as well.
Okay, we will proceed to opening statements. Before those begin, judges, please change your view to speaker view so you can see the individual giving the opening. Plaintiff, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Can you hear and see me okay?
I can, thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. She plotted. She promised. She poisoned. Members of the jury, it's June 7th, 2019. Genesis Petrillo is sitting on her bed, staring at her wedding dress. She's supposed to be happy. She's supposed to be looking forward to saying, I do. But instead, she's petrified. Someone is threatening to kill her. Her soon-to-be mother-in-law, Harper Martini, is going to kill her. The next day, laying in a hospital bed with poison in her veins, Genesis took her last breath. That, members of the jury, is why we are all in trial today. To bring justice to that young woman. And in order to do that, the plaintiff has brought a claim of civil battery against the defendant, Harper Martini. Now, all that means is that in today's trial, we are going to prove to you that it is more likely than not that the defendant intentionally caused harm to Genesis Petrillo on June 7th, 2019. And we're going to do that by showing you that the defendant plotted, she promised, and she poisoned. So let's start at the beginning. Today, you're going to hear from a close family friend of Miss Petrillo, who's going to tell us that from the moment Genesis was engaged to the defendant's daughter, the defendant hated Genesis. That the defendant began plotting to remove Genesis from her life forever. We'll learn that 6 months before that wedding ceremony, the defendant said that she wished she could buy a poison made specifically for Genesis. We'll learn that less than a month before that wedding ceremony, the defendant said that either her or Genesis would make it out of the wedding alive, not both. And finally, members of the jury are going to hear from a musician who was with the defendant less than a week before that wedding ceremony. That musician is going to tell you about the defendant's plot, her plot to take Genesis out of the picture. Now, the evidence in today's trial will show that after days, weeks, months of plotting exactly what the defendant was going to do to Genesis, on June 7th, 2019, she promised to go through with it. See, today we're going to learn that moments before the defendant gave Genesis a unique bottle of wine, she was seen with a can of pesticides, a deadly poison. And now when when the defendant was asked about those pesticides, well, she made a promise to use those pesticides on one and only one person, Genesis Petrillo. Members of the jury, this was no empty promise. No, we'll learn that the defendant delivered those pesticides to Genesis in the form of a unique bottle of wine. And now when Genesis drank that wine laced with a deadly poison, she was rushed to the hospital. We'll learn that her pupils were constricted, her heartbeat was slow, and her muscles were twitching uncontrollably. Symptoms that her treating physician will tell you are classic signs of chemical pesticide poisoning. Now, the defense is going to say that this was a mistake, or that someone, anyone but the defendant is responsible. But by the end of today's trial, you will see that the defendant made it clear. Genesis had until June 7th to leave her daughter. And when Genesis refused, she was dead on the 8th. She plotted, she promised, and she poisoned. It is because of that, at the end of today's trial, we will come before you and ask, as I am asking you now, to find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Opening for the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, can you see and hear me all right?
I can, thank you.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, and members of the jury, may it please the court. Mr. Wallace just came before you and he told you a story. He told you a story about Harper Martini, a woman who supposedly cared so little about her family, so little about her finances, that she plotted and poisoned her daughter's fiance with wine from her own winery. Members of the jury, the plaintiff didn't tell you the whole story. In fact, there's crucial information that Mr. Wallace left out about what else Genesis Petrillo drank that night, about how much pesticide Miss Petrillo had in her system, and how much pesticide can even be fatal. Mr. Wallace didn't leave that information out because he didn't want you to know it. The plaintiff left it out because, as you'll learn today, The tragedy in today's case is that nobody knows what really happened to Genesis Petrillo. There's just too much that we don't know. And therein lies the issue, because the burden in today's case rests with the plaintiff and the plaintiff alone. They need to know what happened, and they need to tell you. The plaintiff must prove the 3 elements of civil battery by a preponderance of the evidence, which means that each one is more likely than not true. Essentially, they have to prove 3 things: intent, act, and harm. So let's take those elements one at a time. First, the plaintiff needs to prove that Harper Martini intended to cause Genesis Petrillo harm. You're going to meet 2 people today who will give you a better idea of whether it's likely that Miss Martini's supposed plotting and promising to kill Miss Petrillo is even true. Blair Osborne, the wedding planner, and Austin Lewis, the chief winemaker at Peony Estates, will come before you and tell you the exact same thing: that Harper Martini loves her daughter Casey Soto more than anything in the world, and that she knew her daughter's wedding needed to go well, and for her daughter's sake, and to bring positive publicity to her business, Peony Estates. Mr. Osborne will tell you that Miss Martini's words were just standard infighting between in-laws, the types of arguments that are typical for a wedding. Second, they need to show that Harper Martini actually acted to hurt Genesis Petrillo. The plaintiff is going to try and tell you today that Harper Martini poisoned a bottle of Cara wine, but members of the jury, you'll hear no forensic evidence, no eyewitness testimony, no one who saw Harper Martini pour pesticides into wine. No one can put pesticides and the bottle of Cara wine in her hands at the same time. And lastly, the plaintiff needs to show that it was Harper Martini's actions that caused Genesis Petrillo to lose her life on June 8th, 2019. Dr. Rachel Cannon is going to take the stand today. She's a medical consultant and a toxicology expert who reviewed Miss Petrillo's visit to the emergency room on June 7th. You'll hear just how much information was missing that night. Incomplete testing, no autopsy, not even access to Genesis Petrillo's medical records. Dr. Cannon will tell you that without all of that information, we don't know, and we can't know, how Genesis Petrillo really died. As you'll learn throughout today's trial, there's just too much that we don't know. And because of that, at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Lauren Forsythe, will come before you and she'll ask that you find Harper Martini not liable.
Thank you, counsel. We'll now begin the plaintiff's case in chief. A reminder to all of the judges to please switch back into gallery view so that you're able to see both the witness and the attorney. Plaintiff, you can call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Angel Rodriguez to the stand. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
My name's Angel Rodriguez.
What do you do for a living, Miss Rodriguez?
I've been teaching first grade in the Midlands for about the last 40 years now at Midlands Elementary. Well, I've been there so long that if you're from the Midlands, I probably taught your mama.
Miss Rodriguez, I want to begin today by talking about someone named Genesis Petrillo. Did you know her?
Yes, sir, I did.
And how'd you know Miss Petrillo?
She was one of my most dearest friends. We met at a trivia night at this bar. I was supposed to be meeting the gals for a bingo night, but I got my wires crossed and I ended up at the wrong wine bar. When I got there, I didn't have a team for trivia, and Genesis invited me to be on their team. Oh, we've been thick as thieves ever since.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, you mentioned that you and Genesis were close. Did you ever meet Genesis's fiance, Casey?
I did. I actually met them on the same night. It was the sweetest thing when the two of them got engaged. They were the type of couple you'd figure be together forever.
Well, were you involved in the wedding planning?
I was. Genesis even asked me to be a maid of honor. I was surprised when she did that, but I couldn't decline. Plus, on the day of, I get to be the arm candy of a handsome young groomsman.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, throughout this wedding planning process, did you ever meet someone named Harper Martini?
Oh, yes. That's Casey's mama. She also owned the winery, Peony Estates, where the wedding was going to be held.
Well, how was Miss Martini involved in the wedding?
Well, she wasn't originally. Right after the engagement of Casey and Genesis, they had their wedding about near planned to a T. Then Harper came in and took over and changed about near every detail about the wedding, and just being flat rude to Genesis along the way. She'd insult her hair and even say she was going to be a bad mother, too.
Ms. Rodriguez, I want to move on and talk about the day of the rehearsal dinner for that wedding, June 7th, 2019. Would you mind telling us how that day began?
Sure. I've been to my fair share of weddings, but this one was different. Harper and Genesis would not stop fighting, and Harper was running around like a headless chicken trying to change things right before the wedding.
You mentioned that Harper and Genesis were fighting. Did you ever catch anything said during these fights?
Yes. During one of those fights, Harper got so angry, she turned to Genesis and said that she should save everybody the heartache and leave the wedding. Or else Harper was going to make Genesis disappear.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, how did Genesis react when the defendant told her she was going to make Genesis disappear?
She was white as a ghost and shaking like a leaf. I'd never seen her so scared. I immediately asked her if she wanted to elope, and I even offered to drive the getaway car, but she said she wanted to stick it through and go on with the wedding. But Genesis told me she was afraid that Harper was going to kill her.
Objection, Your Honor, under Rule 801 to hearsay.
Response, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. These statements fall under hearsay exception 8032, excited utterance.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
You may.
These statements do not fall under hearsay exception 8032 for excited utterance. Excited utterance requires that the person speaking the statement be in such a state of shock that anything they would say would be more likely to be true than not. That's why it's an exception to hearsay. Genesis's statement that she was afraid that Harper might kill her doesn't fall within that characterization and should be excluded from today's trial.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, actually, Ms. Rodriguez just told us about an event in which the defendant told Genesis that she was going to make her disappear. Ms. Rodriguez then went on to explain that Genesis became incredibly scared, ghost white and shaking like a leaf, in fact, and then told Ms. Rodriguez that she thought the defendant was going to kill her. Your Honor, that meets all the conditions as defined under Midland's Rule of Evidence 8032, excited utterance.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Rodriguez, did you ever see...
Motion to strike the relevant testimony, Your Honor.
So stricken.
Now, Ms. Rodriguez, did you ever see the defendant again after she told you she was going to make Genesis disappear?
Yes, I did. As we were sprucing up the place for the dinner, I saw Harper walking towards the employees only section holding a can of pesticides.
Well, did the defendant tell you why she was walking towards the employees only section with a can of pesticides?
Yes. She told me that those pesticides were for Genesis because Genesis was such a pest. She laughed like it was a joke, but I didn't think it was very funny.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, what happened next?
Well, that'd be the rehearsal dinner. I remember Harper giving Genesis a fancy bottle of wine. I remember because it had a dainty little white label on it, and I'd never seen one like it at Peony Estates before.
Did everyone receive a bottle of wine with a white label on it?
No, everybody else got one that was different, had a black label on it.
Ms. Rodriguez, what was the next thing that you remember happening?
I remember the toast, talking with a few other guests at the wedding. And then I remember being in Genesis's room. She was throwing up all over herself and begging me to call 911.
Well, did you call 911?
I must have, because I remember being at the hospital with her that night and Genesis falling into a coma. I was a wreck, but I knew I had to get Casey to the hospital so that she could see her.
Well, what happened when Casey arrived at the hospital?
I remember running into the hospital with Casey. Before we even got to the front desk to ask for Genesis's room, they stopped us at the front door and told us that she'd already passed. Casey just fell to the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Nothing further for this witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Rodriguez, I want to ask you about an interaction you had with Harper Martini that you mentioned in your conversation with Mr. Wallace.
That'll be fine.
You told us that the night of the rehearsal dinner, you saw Miss Martini holding a canister of pesticide.
That's right. Had a little silver screw top on it, and it said bug off pesticides on the side. Yes, sir.
You asked Miss Martini why she was holding that canister.
And that's right. Thought it was pretty odd, but I didn't know. I just figured I'd ask.
She told you it was for Genesis.
And that's right. She said that it was some sort of joke, but I didn't think it was funny.
That's right, Miss Rodriguez. Miss Martini then clarified that she was kidding.
And she said that it was a joke, and I don't understand why someone would make a joke that cruel.
Miss Rodriguez, she told you the actual reason she was holding that pesticide was because another employee had seen a cockroach.
She said something like that, yes, sir.
Now, Miss Rodriguez, you've told us a lot about what you saw the night of the rehearsal dinner, but there's something we need to address. You were intoxicated that night.
I was, sir. I had a little bit to drink that night.
By dinner, you had already lost count of the amount of drinks you'd had.
And that's right. I wasn't really keeping track that night, and I don't really hold my liquor well, so it didn't take much.
So after dinner, you didn't stop drinking.
No, I think I only had about 2 cocktails after dinner, if I remember correctly.
Miss Rodriguez, the next morning you were hungover.
I was, yes, sir.
You would even say that you were still drunk.
I was around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock's when I went to bed, so I didn't get much sleep that night either. So I'm sure that didn't help.
I also have to ask you about your personal attachment to this case. You believe that Harper Martini is responsible for Genesis Petrillo's death?
I do. There's just too much evidence showing that she is, and I don't want to believe it. But I saw how she was acting that day firsthand.
For the past 2 years, you have dedicated as much of your time as possible to bringing Harper Martini to justice.
I don't know about bringing her to justice, but if people want to talk to me about it, I'm not shy about it.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, I lastly want to ask you about some things you may or may not know about Peony Estates and Harper Martini. You're not an employee of Peony Estates.
Oh, no, Sugar, I've never worked for them before. I've been at Midlands Elementary for as long as I can remember.
So you don't know how their car of wine was made?
And no, I just remember her having it uncorked at the ceremony.
You don't know when their car of wine was bottled?
No, the only bottle I ever saw was at the rehearsal dinner.
That bottle you saw at the rehearsal dinner, you don't know when it was corked?
No, sir, I never saw it corked. When I saw it, it was uncorked, and Harper was pouring her a glass.
Ms. Rodriguez, when you saw it, it might have been uncorked, but you don't know whether that bottle was corked before the rehearsal dinner, do you?
And no, I don't know if it was ever corked at all. Didn't see a cork in her hand either.
You've also never seen Harper Martini actually spray pesticides.
And no, Sugar, only time I ever saw her with pesticides when she was walking towards the kitchen with them.
So you certainly never saw Harper Martini put pesticides into a bottle of car wine.
No, sir, I didn't.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. We ask that Ms. Rodriguez be excused, and we have one more matter to take up with the court before we.
Okay, Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. What is that matter you'd like to bring up, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff moves to enter Exhibits 18D and 18E into evidence. Pursuant to Midland's Rule of Evidence 90211, these documents are self-authenticating and don't require the additional testimony of any witnesses.
Response, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor. We agree with that characterization and we have no objection to their admittance into evidence.
Okay, those two exhibits are entered. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to screen share them briefly?
You may.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm now screen sharing Exhibits 18D and Exhibits 18E. Pursuant to Special Instruction 15, the plaintiff wishes to read portions of this document onto the record as long as it's taken out of our total direct examination time.
Any objection by defense?
No objection, Your Honor, so long as it's taken out of the direct time. This is perfectly allowable.
Go ahead, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. First reading from Exhibit 18D, which was a voicemail sent from the defendant 6 months before the wedding. The defendant said, "Say what you will about them, but if they sold a Genesis pesticide, I'd probably give them another $1 billion. Then, Your Honor, reading from Exhibit 18E, which was sent less than a month before that wedding ceremony. The defendant said, "Miserable, selfish Genesis. I've had enough. I'm beyond the breaking point."
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 403, may I be heard?
Counsel, these items have already been entered into evidence, so the information in them would also be admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. I have no objection to the information in these exhibits being read onto the record, but specifically I'd like to object to opposing counsel reading these exhibits with such an inflection as to make them more than they are. Simply reading these sentences onto the record is not objectionable, but using this emphasis, characterizing it in this way is more prejudicial than it is probative under Rule 403. That inflection adds no probative value.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. I don't believe I'm adding any prejudicial value to these voicemails. As you can see, the defendant uses phrases like miserable, selfish Genesis. I've had enough. I'm beyond my breaking point. I'm just reading them onto the record pursuant to Special Instruction 15.
Objection is noted, but I am going to overrule. You may continue reading that portion.
Yes, Your Honor. Miserable, selfish Genesis. I've had enough. I'm beyond the breaking point. It's going to be me or Genesis, not both of us. And with that, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed to the next witness.
Plaintiff, go ahead and call your next witness.
Can Your Honor see and hear me all right?
I can, thank you.
At this time, the plaintiff calls Devin Johar to the stand. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Sure. Hi, my name is Devin Johar.
What do you do for a living?
Yeah, okay. I like to call myself a one-stop shop for all your party needs. You know, I can DJ for your wedding. As you can see, it's kind of my passion, but don't worry. I can also set up chairs, pick up the pizza on the way to the party. And on the DL between you and I, if you got someone who might object during your wedding ceremony, I can take care of them too, no questions asked, and all for an affordable price.
Well, how did you get your career started, Devin?
Yeah, okay. Long story short, it was my cousin Ricky's getting out of jail party, a big day for all of us. And my cousin had no music, right? So I'm sitting there with my Nickelback and my Van Halen CDs, God rest his soul. And my cousin goes, "Yo, DJ, you got the music." And I said, "Do I ever?" Right? And, I gave in, and I've been booking gigs around Midlands ever since.
Devin, I want to talk about a place called Peony Estates, specifically on June 7th of 2019. Were you there on that day?
Yes, I was. Yeah, I was hired by a Harper Martini. That is the owner of Peony Estates. Yeah, she hired me to DJ her kid's wedding. She said she wanted something fresh, something funky and something cheap. And that is all I do, baby. I am the low budget life of the party here in Midlands. Everyone loves DJ,
Your Honor, at this time, we are now going to display what's been pre-admitted as Exhibits 2A and 2B. Now, Devin, what are we looking at?
Yeah, this is a bottle of wine. This is a Cara bottle of wine. It reads there, and I saw it at the rehearsal dinner that day.
When did you first see this bottle of wine?
Yeah,
Objection,
so
Your Honor, to a lack of foundation at this point. May I be heard?
May.
Your Honor, whether or not this witness has seen a bottle of wine that has this label on it is one thing, but if she had seen the bottle of wine, I have it on a good faith basis to believe that this witness will talk about 2 distinct times of seeing a bottle of wine that looks like this, and no foundation has been laid to show that this would have been either of those. How many bottles of Cara wine there are that exist, therefore the foundation hasn't been laid for this witness to talk about this bottle in particular.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, both parties have agreed that this is the bottle of wine in question that was found in a dumpster outside Peony Estates. This is the bottle of Cara wine that is at hand today, Your Honor. And Ms. Johar just testified that this is the bottle of wine that she saw. We've laid sufficient foundation for Ms. Johar to testify as to her knowledge and what she observed.
May I briefly respond, Your Honor?
You may.
While we have agreed that this bottle of wine was found in the dumpster that day and that bottle of wine was the one Genesis consumed, we don't know whether or not other bottles of this wine exist and whether or not Ms. Johar saw those other bottles of wine. Therefore, this should not be admissible at this point.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Briefly, yes.
Your Honor, this is a matter of weight and not admissibility. If opposing counsel wishes to cross-examine Ms. Johar on the veracity of her statements here today, she certainly may.
Going to sustain the objection for lack of foundation. I don't know that this witness can say specifically that the bottle of wine found in the dumpster was the one she saw during the rehearsal dinner. She can certainly testify to seeing a bottle that looked similar with the same label on that day.
Yes,
Your Honor, motion to strike the offending testimony about this bottle.
If any was entered, then yes, it is stricken.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now, Devin, based on what you observed, when did you first see a bottle of wine that looked like this?
Yeah, let's see. So, like I said, I saw a bottle that looked like this at the rehearsal dinner. But the first time, let's see, it was sitting back in the bottling area of Peony Estates, and I remember that it was kind of odd to me, right? Because it was sitting there, completely full, and it was open, right? Like they hadn't put in a bag or nothing yet, right?
Well, when was the next time that you saw a bottle of wine matching this description?
Yeah. So the next time I saw it, it was a Hopper Martini. She was holding the bottle. I turned the corner, saw her holding that bottle.
Was it still open then?
No, it wasn't. This time I saw a cork in the top.
Well, how did Harper Martini react when you saw her holding that now corked bottle of wine?
Yeah,
Objection, Your Honor, to the phrasing of the now corked bottle of wine being a lack of foundation. Again, may I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, the insinuation that this is the same bottle of wine that Ms. Johar had seen before, there's no foundation laid to demonstrate that that is the case. We still haven't heard whether or not other bottles of this exist. And while this witness can testify that it looks the same, this witness just testified that this bottle, the one she had seen earlier, was now corked. And there's no foundation laid for that.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
This witness just testified that this was the only bottle of wine that she saw in the bottling area when she entered it. Therefore, it's within her rationally based perception, and the foundation has been laid that there were no other bottles in the area at that time. Therefore, it's reasonable for Ms. Johar to testify that this was the bottle of wine that she saw.
May I briefly respond, Your Honor?
You may.
I have it on a good faith basis to believe that between the time that she had initially seen the bottle and the time that she claimed she had seen the bottle again, Ms. Johar actually left the room and then came back. Now, what happened in that room and who was in that room and who was touching bottles and what kind of bottles existed in there, no foundation has been laid. And I believe it can't be laid to show that Ms. Johar would reasonably and rationally be able to say that.
May I be heard on those grounds, Your Honor?
You may.
Once again, this is a matter of weight and not admissibility. If that is opposing counsel's contention, they may certainly cross-examine on that. But Ms. Johar has just testified that she briefly left the room. She had only seen one bottle of wine in that area, And as soon as she came back, Harper Martini had entered the room and would be holding that bottle of wine, but instead corked. It's reasonable for Ms. Johar to assume and to witness this bottle of wine and assume it was the same.
Objection overruled. You can proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Johar, what were you saying about that bottle of wine?
Sure. So, like I said, I'm turning the corner. I was looking for Harper, and I saw Harper, and she was standing there with that bottle of wine, now with the cork in it. And when she saw me, she was kind of surprised, right? As she kicked something beneath the table, and then was acting all weird and jumpy, and like she'd seen a ghost. Which, I wouldn't be surprised. The cellars down there are kind of scary.
You said a moment ago that Harper Martini was holding that bottle. Did you ever see a bottle resembling that one again?
Yeah, I did. It was later that night at the rehearsal dinner. Harper Martini gave that very same bottle, or what I thought was that I'd seen earlier. I saw her give it to Genesis during the speech.
Did you ever drink that wine?
No. I did try though. Towards the end of the night, it was the fanciest bottle of wine I'd ever seen. Right, so I walk over there to pour myself a glass, but before I even get the chance, Harper Martini all of a sudden comes up behind me, just like Batman, right? And she told me that if I wanted to drink, I could go over to the bar and get a shot, but I wouldn't be drinking that bottle of wine.
Well, when was the last time that you saw that bottle of wine?
Last time, okay, let's see. It was real early. It was that next morning. It was after everyone had found out that the wedding was off. I saw Harper on her way over to the Peony Estates dumpsters, and she had it in her hands. I remember she also had these purple latex gloves on while holding that bottle.
Well, Devin, I want to take a step back for a minute. Was the wedding rehearsal dinner the first time that you met Harper Martini?
No, not at all. I actually first met Harper Martini at a previous event at Peony Estates.
What did you talk about when you first met her?
Sure, yeah. I mean, at first she asked me to DJ the wedding. I said yes. But then she started telling me all about, her plans for the winery, to have her kid, Casey, take over it, and how, the soon-to-be in-law Genesis would never support it.
What did she tell you after she said Genesis wouldn't support it?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, right? She said she wasn't too worried, pardon me. I said that she had a plan.
Well, during that conversation, when she told you that she had a plan, what was she doing?
So at the very start, she was writing something down and talking to me at the same time.
Did you see what she was writing?
Yeah, I did.
Would you recognize that writing if I were to show it to you?
Yeah, I believe I would, yeah. I mean, she was using a purple pen and everything. It's very distinctive.
Your Honor, permission to share Exhibit 24?
You may.
Ms. Johar, what is this?
This is what I saw Harper writing down that day.
Is it a fair and accurate copy?
As far as I'm aware, yeah.
Has it been changed since the last time you saw this note?
Not that I'm aware of.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff moves to admit Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection pursuant to 801D, Your Honor.
Okay, so admitted.
Ms. Johar, what did this letter tell Genesis to do?
Yeah. Well, in this letter, it asked Genesis to leave Casey.
Does it say what will happen if Genesis refused to leave Casey?
Yeah, it said if she didn't, that she would take her out of the picture the hard way.
Do you know when Harper wrote this note?
Yeah, I do. At the time that I saw her writing it, it was a week before the wedding.
Ms. Johar, it says there that Genesis had until the 7th. Do you know when Genesis died?
I do, yeah, I do. It was the morning of the 8th.
Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions, but I would like to publish Exhibits 2A, 2B, and 24 to the jury.
So published. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Johar.
Good afternoon.
I just want to start off on what you might or might not know about Peony Estates on June 7th. Now, you mentioned You mentioned that you went into the bottling area that night, right?
Yeah, that's right. I did. I didn't know whether Hopper wanted the cha-cha slide or the electric slide. People have very different tastes on that these days. So I followed her down there.
Well, initially when you entered the bottling room, Miss Martini wasn't there, was she?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't see her, so I started making circles, didn't know where to check.
Miss Johar, when you initially went in that bottling room, you didn't see any pesticides there, did you?
Pesticides? No, I didn't see any pesticides, but I did see one bottle of wine. The one I talked about earlier with the no cap or anything.
So then you left that bottling area, didn't you?
Yeah.
And when you went back in that bottling area, it was minutes later, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I would say so.
That's when you found Harper Martini holding that bottle of wine.
That's correct. Yeah, and she started acting all jumpy, all like Devin,
But Miss Johar, she didn't have a bottle of pesticides in her hand, did she?
No, she had the bottle of wine from earlier, with a cap in it this time. She did kick something, though. I don't know what that was.
Miss Johar, just to be clear, you didn't see any pesticides in the bottling room again when Miss Harper Martini was present.
Yeah, that's right. Like when I came back around the corner, there were no pesticides, same as before.
So then you went back out to the rehearsal dinner with Miss Martini, didn't you?
I did, yeah. She led the way.
And you saw Miss Martini give that bottle of wine to Genesis Petrillo.
Yeah, it wasn't in that order exactly. I went back out, I played some tunes for the kids, then the dinner started, they did speeches, and then Harper gave that bottle to Genesis.
Right, Miss Johar, Miss Martini gave that bottle of her during the speeches part of that wedding rehearsal.
Yeah.
She didn't do it in private, did she?
I know, she did it during the speeches, like you said.
Miss Johar, she gave Miss Petrillo that bottle of wine in front of everyone.
Yeah, I'd say so, yeah.
So then later, you wanted to try that wine. You mentioned that in your conversation with Miss Brawley.
I did, yeah. I don't want to brag, but I only usually drink boxed wine, right? So Harper had kept going on saying, this is just for Genesis. It's going to be really good. And I was like, maybe I should try it.
But you mentioned in your conversation with Miss Brawley that Harper stopped you, right?
Yeah, she did, came up behind me, was like, oh, Devin, you want something to drink? We can take some shots.
Miss Johar, she didn't tell you, stop, don't drink that wine, did she?
No, she didn't. She just sort of stopped, came around me and said, well, why don't we get some shots instead?
Miss Johar, she didn't take that bottle of wine and move it elsewhere.
No.
Miss Johar, both you and Miss Martini walked away from that table, leaving the bottle just sitting there, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what got you here today, Miss Johar. Now, you were initially contacted by Miss Brawley and the rest of Plaintiff Counsel back in July.
That is correct, yeah.
When they came to you, you told them you didn't have any information.
That's correct, yeah. And at the time, I thought I didn't. They were like, Genesis Petrillo was killed. Did you see a killer? And I said, no. And then later I see all these news reports about pesticide in wine, poisoning. And I thought, gee, I was around a lot of wine at that winery. Maybe I'd seen something.
Well, Ms. Johar, I just want to talk again about what you did in that scenario. Now, you didn't come forward to the plaintiff a week later, did you?
Yeah, that's right. I'm also ashamed to say it there too. I kind of lost the number. I'm not the most organized person.
Ms. Johar, you didn't come forward with any information until 7 months later, did you?
Yeah, that's right. I was sleeping on it. I wasn't sure who to go to or who to call. I tried 911, but they said, this is an emergency hotline. You can't call here. And that's when I started to see, the hotlines on the TV.
Ms. Johar, I'm just looking for a yes or a no, ma'am.
I'm so sorry.
And the question was, you waited 7 months to come forward with that information, didn't you?
That's right, yeah.
But when you came forward with that information, you didn't call up Miss Brawley and the rest of Plaintiff Counsel and tell them, did you?
Yeah, that's right. Like I said, I lost the number. I'm sorry.
Miss Johar, you didn't call anyone related to the Plaintiff Counsel at all, did you?
I wasn't sure who to reach. I mean, like I said, 911 turned me away. But then on the TV, they were saying, we're still looking for information. Here's a hotline. If you or your buds know anyone, contact us. We'll get you up there and get the news out. And I said, that's where I got to go, right?
But the television people, they didn't connect you to Miss Brawley, did they?
Oh, they didn't. They put a big camera on me. Strange.
Miss Johar, I just want to make it clear. You did a television interview, right?
Yeah, that's right. There wasn't any other option. You know, they didn't have Miss Rowley's number. They just said, we're going to put you on. You're going to share what you know. And I said, okay, I can do that, Chief.
And since that television interview, it's true that your popularity has skyrocketed, isn't it?
You know, I hate to say it, but I think you're right. I was booked for a bar mitzvah next week at a Chuck E. Cheese. I think I might make rent.
Miss Johar, you gained thousands of social media followers.
Yeah, I gained 1,000 new subscribers. You know, just to be transparent with the court, I will say that same week, the Midland Zoo released the video of a squirrel playing the drums, and they titled
Miss
it
Johar,
DJ
again,
Squirrel.
I'm just looking for a yes or a no here, and it's true that you gained thousands of social media followers from your television interview.
That's true, yeah. But if I can explain, I just want to be honest with you. I don't know if they all came from me. They might have come from the dancing squirrel. But for me, for my sake, I'll say I got it myself. Yeah.
Miss Johar, just to be clear, you're testifying voluntarily here today, right?
That's right, I am. You know, my grandma always said, if you can do the right thing, Devin, you should do the right thing. So that is why I'm here.
Miss Johar, I'm just looking for a yes or a no here. You came forward to testify because before you came here and testified today, you could only imagine what testifying would do for your brand.
That's right. You know, I thought maybe I could help solve the case, and then maybe I could book another bar mitzvah, maybe another gig to help me make it through rent, you know?
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Devin, why did you recently come forward with information about this case?
Well, like I said, I just want to do what's right. You know, I want to make sure that everyone has all the facts. And if I did see or hear anything useful, that hopefully you guys will be able to make things right, you know, bring everything to justice.
Thank you, Devin. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Any recross based on that?
No recross, Your Honor.
Ms. Johar, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. Does the plaintiff have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we call Dr. Kwan to the stand. Permission to proceed.
You may.
Good afternoon. Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kwan.
And what do you do for a living, doctor?
I'm the chief emergency physician at the River Valley Hospital here in Midlands. I'm also a mom to 4 little girls, so I guess you could say I have 2 full-time jobs.
And what's your educational background?
I graduated from the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. After med school, I completed my residency in toxicology at Emory University. Don't get me wrong, 14 years of student debt, it isn't easy, but I fell in love with emergency care.
Well, have you ever testified in court before?
Yes, countless times.
Wonderful. Then you know exactly how this goes, doctor. Let's start with why you're here today. Can you explain that to us?
I was asked by both parties to write a report for today's case because I treated Genesis Petrillo in the emergency room the night that she passed away.
And how did you treat Miss Petrillo?
The method that we use in the ER is RCA, or root cause analysis. It's separated into 3 stages: symptom analysis, testing, and then treatment.
Now, is that RCA method standard in your field?
Absolutely. It's the gold standard for physicians across the board.
And for Ms. Petrillo's case specifically, did you apply this RCA method accurately?
Of course.
Wonderful. Doctor, let's focus on June 8th, 2019. Can you describe the first time you encountered Ms. Genesis Petrillo that morning?
It was around 2 a.m. She entered in an ambulance and was vomiting uncontrollably, having difficulty breathing, and was experiencing severe chest pains. I had my staff take samples for testing, but we admitted her and I was able to perform an examination as well as my symptom analysis.
Doctor, could you explain what exactly a symptom analysis is?
Yes, of course. It's rather simple. In a symptom analysis, we take the symptoms that a patient is exhibiting and we compare them to the standard symptoms of what we believe the patient's suffering from, as well as the symptoms of any other potential cause.
Well, what did this symptom analysis say about Ms. Petrillo's case?
Since Ms. Petrillo did enter the hospital intoxicated, I was required to check for alcohol poisoning. However, in this symptom analysis, there were major inconsistencies. I flagged 3 specifically related to her pupils, her muscles, and her pulse.
At this time, Your Honor, permission to display what Dr. Kwan has brought along with her as a demonstrative aid.
Permission granted.
Doctor, let's take those 3 symptoms one by one. Let's start with Ms. Petrillo's pupils. Can you explain why you flagged those?
Absolutely. In alcohol poisoning, the pupils dilate. This just means they become larger to let in more light. As you can see with the eye we're looking at here. And now Ms. Petrillo's pupils were acting in a separate fashion. They were constricting or becoming smaller, like you can see with this eye on the right here. Now, this is inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
Now, that second symptom you mentioned, Ms. Petrillo's muscles, can you explain why that one was flagged?
Well, you see, alcohol is a depressant, so it relaxes the muscles. And in cases of alcohol poisoning, it relaxes the muscles to an extreme. Ms. Petrillo's muscles were twitching involuntarily and spasming at a rapid pace. Again, this is inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
Now, that third and final symptom, her pulse. Can you elaborate on that one for us, doctor?
In alcohol poisoning, the pulse speeds up. It becomes rapid and sounds something along the lines of this right here. Now, Ms. Petrillo's pulse was slowed down significantly. It sounded something along the lines of this pulse right here. Again, this is inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
So if these 3 symptoms aren't consistent with alcohol poisoning, what are they consistent with, doctor?
A different type of poisoning, actually, organophosphate poisoning.
I'm sorry, doctor, could you explain what exactly an organophosphate poison is?
Yes, of course. An organophosphate is a human-made chemical designed to kill insects, so it's in pesticides for that reason. However, this pesticide, it can be dangerous for humans. It can even be lethal.
Well, let's move on to the next stage of that RCA method, testing. Did you test for this organophosphate pesticide?
Yes, I had my staff run a series of tests that night.
Now displaying what has been pre-admitted as Exhibit 6. Doctor, what part of this test did you take note of?
If I could point your attention to the middle of the page here, specifically for the blood and stomach contents, you'll see isofenphos. Isofenphos is just a component of that organophosphate pesticide I was talking about. Again, it can be very dangerous for humans.
Were you able to determine how this organophosphate pesticide got into Ms. Petrillo's system?
Yes, we were able to determine that she ingested it. The wine that she was drinking from that night tested positive for pesticides. This was able to tell us that this was the most
Objection,
likely
Your Honor,
source.
to an improper opinion. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, this document that Dr. Kwan is testifying to, specifically this lab report from Meta Laboratories, is not something that Dr. Kwan ordered herself. It is a test that she was not made aware of before she treated and diagnosed Ms. Petrillo. It's information that she received after the fact, and therefore was not part of the facts and data that led her to her conclusions in today's case. Her using it now under Richards v. Mississippi Barbecue is an improper opinion and should not be admissible.
If I may, Your Honor.
Please.
Richards versus Mississippi Barbecue actually deals with the admitting of evidence, specifically things like charts and exhibits, admitting them into evidence. Opposing counsel and I have already agreed that exhibit number 10 is pre-admitted. In regards to Dr. Kwan reviewing this, Dr. Kwan has reviewed it. In fact, she said that she did on the stand today. So this was vital in coming to her conclusion that this bottle of wine was the most likely cause of those organophosphate pesticides.
Your Honor, if I may respond on those grounds.
You may.
The specific language of Richards v. Mississippi Barbecue asks the courts to distinguish experts from conduits who merely repeat what they are told. And Dr. Kwan was given this lab report by the police. At the bottom of this report, it says that it was collected by the police and it was ordered by the police. She was in no way involved with the creation of this report. And additionally, under the prongs of 702 and 703, whatever facts and data an expert relies upon has to relate to their specialized knowledge. Now, Dr. Kwan may be an expert in medical toxicology, but she is not an expert in chemicals, chemical pesticides, or those types of concentrations. So it can't be related to her specialized knowledge. Having her testify to it is an improper opinion.
Thank you for your objection.
Fair enough.
I'm going to overrule the objection because this exhibit has already been admitted into evidence. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, I'll re-ask my question. Were you able to determine how these organophosphate pesticides got into Ms. Petrillo's system?
Yes, we were. We were able to determine that she ingested it. As you can see here, the wine that she was drinking from that night tested positive for those same pesticides that we found in her stomach. We were able to determine that this was the most likely source.
Now, I just want to be clear. Is there anything else that could have caused those pesticides to enter Ms. Petrillo's system?
No. You see, we tested all of the food in her stomach and it came back negative for pesticides. Additionally, this wine bottle tells us that that wine was the most likely source. We were able to run calculations based off of the proportions of her stomach contents that concluded that as well.
Let's talk about that third and final phase of the RCA method treatment. How did you treat Ms. Petrillo for these organophosphate poisons?
I administered the standard antidote for pesticide poisoning. You see, the longer you let this toxin sit in the system, the more time it has to absorb into the bloodstream and become lethal. Unfortunately, that was the case with Ms. Petrillo. I watched as she fell into a seizure and lost consciousness completely.
And what did you do next, doctor?
At that point, there wasn't much we could do. I switched my focus from active medical care to comfort and stable care.
Doctor, exactly what time did Ms. Petrillo pass away?
9:27 a.m. After she passed away, I filled out her death certificate and handed it to her father.
And on that death certificate, what did you conclude was the official cause of death?
Ms. Petrillo ingested an organophosphate pesticide through a bottle of wine. This pesticide is what ultimately led to her death.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan, for your time. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Kwan.
Good
I want to
afternoon.
start off by talking about some of the symptoms that you mentioned in your conversation with Mr. Smith.
Absolutely.
Now, you guys showed a chart of Miss Petrillo's symptoms on the night that she entered your emergency room. Mr. Wood, if you could display that on screen. And Dr. Kwan, you listed 3 symptoms on this chart, right?
Yes, these are the 3 major symptoms that I found issue with as they were not consistent with alcohol poisoning.
But these weren't all of the symptoms that Miss Petrillo was exhibiting.
No, like I said earlier, she came in vomiting, her speech was slurred, she was having difficulty walking. Again, these are just the 3 major symptoms that were inconsistent with alcohol poisoning.
Exactly. She was showing many other symptoms, many of which are consistent with alcohol poisoning or pesticide poisoning, right?
Yes, that's right. That's why these symptoms were so important, because they're what we were able to use to initially rule out that alcohol poisoning diagnosis.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. You can take that down. Well, as part of the method you use, you also order and analyze tests to confirm those symptoms, right, Dr. Kwan?
Yes, that is the second stage of that RCA method that we use.
So you ordered Miss Petrillo a blood alcohol content test.
Yes, a BAC test.
You also ordered her a toxicology screen test.
That's right, among other tests that we did order.
Just to be clear, you didn't receive the results of either of those tests before treating Miss Petrillo.
That's right. We got them shortly after she died. Unfortunately, the emergency room is usually a life or death situation. We have to act quickly. Those test results didn't come back in time for me to treat her.
So Dr. Kwan, just to be clear, that's a yes to my question. You didn't receive the results of either of those tests before you went about treating Miss Petrillo.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. That's usually not standard in the field. We typically don't get those tests back from the lab until later in the night.
Dr. Kwan, Ms. Petrillo passed away at 9:30 on June 8th.
Yes, 9:27 a.m.
You filled out Ms. Petrillo's death certificate.
That's correct.
You filled out her death certificate before receiving the results of either of those tests.
That's incorrect.
Well, Dr. Kwan, before receiving those tests, you filled out a preliminary form of Ms. Petrillo's certificate of death.
I listed a preliminary cause of death. It wasn't on the death certificate, though. That's incorrect.
Well, Dr. Kwan, on Ms. Petrillo's death certificate, Mr. Wood, if you could put up Exhibit 7, Your Honor, this has been pre-admitted by both parties according to Stipulation 3. You listed Ms. Petrillo's official cause of death as being due to organophosphate pesticide poisoning.
That's right. And at the bottom, which is cut off here, you can see that it was done on 3/14, which was after she died.
Well, Dr. Kwan, I want to direct your attention to this second section. You said that she ingested organophosphate pesticide at lethal doses.
That's correct. That's what we were able to determine.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. You can take that down now. Dr. Kwan, I'm looking for a number. Can you tell us the amount of organophosphate pesticide that was in Ms. Petrillo's system?
No, you see, we're not able to measure that amount. We're just able to tell whether it's a high dose, a medium dose, a small dose. And obviously this was a lethal dose today.
Well, Dr. Kwan, you're telling us that it's impossible to measure a specific dose of pesticide in a patient's system?
Yes, the exact number. It's not actually necessary to see how much is in a patient's system because even in small amounts, any ingested level of this pesticide, it can be lethal.
You believe any suspected ingestion could be deadly, right, Dr.
That's
Kwan?
correct. That's right. That's why we have to treat it very efficiently in the hospital.
It's fair to say that people can survive consuming trace amounts of pesticide.
Absolutely. If they're given this antidote that works effectively within a certain amount of time, it cannot be lethal. However, that's why it's so crucial to treat those patients quickly and effectively within the hospital.
Dr. Kwan, even without an antidote, people have survived consuming trace amounts of pesticide.
Yes, it's rare with this organophosphate, though.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Your Honor, no further questions at this time.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Kwan, we heard a little bit about alcohol poisoning. Is it possible that Ms. Petrillo died from alcohol poisoning?
In my opinion, no. You see, we tested her BAC around 3 in the morning and it was 0.16%. When she passed away, it was 6.5 hours later. So her BAC would have declined over time and been around 0 by the time she died. That in combination with the symptoms that she was showing is able to tell us that no, she was not suffering from alcohol poisoning.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Your Honor, I have no further questions, and barring any recross, I simply ask that Dr. Kwan be dismissed.
Any recross based on that question, counsel?
No recross, Your Honor. This witness can be excused.
Kwan, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. Plaintiff, do you have any additional witnesses?
No, Your Honor, the plaintiff will go ahead and rest its case in chief. We simply ask for a brief 5 to 10 minute recess, time allowing.
I believe we have time for about 5 minutes, so I'll see you all back then. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor.
Are both sides back and ready to proceed?
The plaintiff is back and ready to proceed, Your Honor.
The defense is back and ready to proceed with our case in chief.
Thank you. Defense, you may call your first witness.
The defense calls Dr. Rachel Cannon. May we proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Good evening. Hello, my name is Dr. Rachel Cannon.
Dr. Cannon, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a medical consultant for Gardner Consulting, where I focus on cases involving toxicology, which is just a fancy phrase for cases involving toxins or poisonous substances. And I also focus on cases involving pharmacology.
What sort of things does a medical consultant do?
Well, I review available medical information in a case, and then I assess the accuracy of the medical conclusions in that case. And this is pretty important because medicine, and especially toxicology, it can be very complex, so errors can be made.
What educational background do you need to become a medical consultant?
Well, I started off at the Ohio State University, where I got my bachelor's in chemistry before moving on to Harvard Medical School, where I specialized in toxicology there and got my MD.
Dr. Cannon, you've mentioned several times that you specialize in toxicology. Do you have any specific work experience in that field?
Yes, I've been working in toxicology for about 25 years now. I actually started as a director of toxicology at Massachusetts General Hospital before moving on to academia to teach toxicology at Midlands Medical School, just 8 miles down the road.
Have you ever been published in the field of toxicology?
Yes, many times. By this point, I've authored around 50 articles relating to toxicology, medicine, and treatment.
Have you ever testified in court as a toxicology expert before?
Once again, yes, many times. By now, probably I've testified in around 35 legal cases.
Dr. Cannon, could you tell us how you're involved in today's case?
Well, I was hired by defense counsel to review the work and conclusions of Dr. Kwan relating to the death of Genesis Petrillo.
What sort of materials were you given to prepare for your testimony today?
I reviewed toxicology and laboratory reports ordered by Dr. Kwan. I thoroughly reviewed Dr. Kwan's report. I reviewed Ms. Petrillo's death certificate, an analytical report of a Cara wine bottle, as well as an affidavit.
Do you use any particular method when looking at these sort of materials?
Well, I used what's primarily known as comparative analysis, which involves analyzing the materials produced and given by this case, Dr. Kwan, taking those and comparing them to the industry best practices. And from there, I can assess the accuracy and the likelihood of those medical conclusions in the case.
Using that comparative analysis method, were you able to reach a conclusion in today's case?
Yes, I was.
What conclusions were you able to reach?
Based on my review of the available medical records and the details of Dr. Kwan's treatment and diagnosis, there's simply a lack of evidence to support Dr. Kwan's conclusion that Ms. Petrillo died of organophosphate poisoning, at least to any degree of scientific certainty.
Dr. Cannon, what do you mean by a lack of evidence?
Well, when a patient passes away, we need to work to find out that cause of death, especially if any poisoning may be involved here. And so we do this by confirming tests, confirming symptoms, and confirming unknown toxins in a person's body. And all of those were very much missing in this case.
Dr. Cannon, I want to take those missing pieces of information one at a time, starting with the first, confirming tests. What does that mean?
Well, whenever there is a suspected poisoning as the cause of death, we need to not only identify any substances that were in a person's body, but determine or approximate the amount of substance in that person's body. So this is typically done through blood and urine tests, or if a patient does pass away, through running follow-up post-mortem tests through an autopsy.
Do you know if Dr. Kwan ran any of those tests for Miss Petrillo?
She did run a simple toxicology report using Ms. Petrillo's blood and vomit samples, but that report did provide 2 flags that needed to be looked into further.
Your Honor, at this time, we'll be displaying the results of that toxicology report, Exhibit 5, on the screen, which has been pre-admitted according to Stipulation 3. So, Dr. Cannon, looking at this report, what was that first flag you mentioned we should have been looking at?
Well, first was this low acetylcholinesterase level, which is just a fancy word for an enzyme that can be referred to as ACH. And this is an enzyme in the body that's often linked to pesticide poisoning, but it's not really conclusive, it's not deadly, nor is it really the sole indicator of pesticide poisoning. This is where we have to look at a patient's medical history to determine if a low ACH might have been common.
Do you know if Dr. Kwan consulted Miss Petrillo's medical history?
To my knowledge, she did not.
Dr. Cannon, you mentioned a second flag we should be looking at on that toxicology report. Mr. Wood, if you could put Exhibit 5 back on screen. Dr. Cannon, what was that second flag we should be looking at?
Well, Ms. Petrillo had a positive blood alcohol concentration, or BAC, of 0.16. And having a positive flag for alcohol consumption should lead to further investigation into a peak BAC, which would then allow doctors to rule alcohol poisoning in or out as a potential cause of death.
Do you know if Dr. Kwan did further investigation into Genesis Petrillo's peak BAC?
To my knowledge, she did not.
I want to move on to that second piece of missing information you mentioned about confirming symptoms.
Sure.
What exactly does that mean?
Well, for example, I'm sure that you have a friend that seems significantly intoxicated after 1 or 2 drinks, while another friend seems perfectly fine after many, many more. That's because our body all processes toxins differently, so we need to confirm the symptoms that we see.
What symptoms did Dr. Kwan see in Miss Petrillo?
Well, according to her report, Dr. Kwan noted slurred speech, not being able to walk properly, trouble holding her bladder, muscle twitching, constricted pupils, things like that.
So what cause of death or poisoning do those symptoms align with?
Well, some do line up with pesticide poisoning, and some do line up with alcohol poisoning, and some line up with hepatic or liver disease. So quite simply, without confirming the symptoms, you aren't really able to determine a definitive cause of death.
How does one go about confirming those symptoms?
Well, upon the death of a patient, you would run post-mortem tests through an autopsy.
So what were the results of Miss Petrillo's autopsy?
We don't know. To my knowledge, Dr. Kwan did not order an autopsy.
Dr. Cannon, I want to move on to that third piece of missing information you mentioned regarding confirming unknown toxins. What exactly does that mean?
Well, Dr. Kwan did run an unknown poisons and toxins analysis, but this is just a screen. It says that there is a presence of something. And Dr. Kwan claimed that there were pesticides in a lethal dose, but we don't even have a ballpark of how much that might be.
Dr. Cannon, if we don't know the amount of pesticide in Miss Petrillo's system, is it possible for it to have been a non-lethal dose?
Sure, yes. A lethal dose can be different for different people, especially with pesticides. Many people have survived consuming trace amounts of pesticides. So Dr. Kwan saying that any pesticide consumption is deadly, that's a bit overstated. In the medical field, you can't simply take a doctor's word for it. You need data about the amount in her system, and that this amount was fatal if it's going to be declared as the definitive cause of death. But we don't have that here, and we never will. We just don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Your Honor, no further questions at this time.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
May.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cannon. My name is Jacob Smith. I just have a few questions I'd like to ask you, and then we'll get you out of here, okay?
Sure, sounds good.
I'd like to start off with something you mentioned on direct examination, that Ms. Petrillo could have died from alcohol poisoning. Did I say that correctly?
That remains a possibility, yes.
Let's examine that possibility.
Sure.
You agree with me that Ms. Petrillo's BAC was tested at 3 a.m., right?
Yes,
And that test showed that Ms. Petrillo's BAC was a 0.16%.
yes, that's true. However, it's important to note that this 0.16, this isn't her peak BAC. It could have been higher.
Exactly. Now, that BAC, that 0.16%, we'd both agree that's not a lethal BAC, right, doctor?
That's true.
In fact, a lethal BAC would have to be closer to 0.3.
Exactly. It would have to be higher. And by the time that this BAC was tested with Ms. Petrillo, it was on that downward trajectory.
Of course. Now, you would agree with me that there is no scientific evidence to suggest Ms. Petrillo's BAC was anywhere near 0.3, right?
That's true. Unfortunately, there are a lack of tests and a lack of available information that would allow me to conclude that.
Now, Ms. Petrillo died at 9:30 a.m. or thereabouts, right?
That's true.
So Ms. Petrillo's BAC was falling for 6.5 hours before she died, right, doctor?
Sure, around then.
So when Ms. Petrillo died, her BAC would have been substantially lower than 0.16.
Yes, by the time she passed away.
Let's move on to another thing you mentioned on direct examination, doctor. You mentioned organophosphate pesticides.
Yes,
Now, you would agree with me that the most likely cause of Ms. Petrillo's death, well, that's respiratory arrest, right?
that's true. Yes.
And the most likely cause of that respiratory arrest was organophosphate pesticides.
Yes. However, it's important to note that just because something is stated to be most likely, that does not mean that it is that likely at all.
Absolutely, I agree with you. In fact, I'd like to go a little deeper into that. Mr. Wallace, if we can go ahead and get Exhibit 6 up on the screen. Your Honor, this has already been pre-admitted. Now, this test was conducted on Ms. Petrillo's blood and stomach contents, right?
That's true.
And as you can see there, in both of those, organophosphate pesticides were found.
That is true. However, there were more things that were found in these contents, such as alcohol, for instance.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I'll bring you back to my question. Organophosphate pesticides were found in Ms. Petrillo's blood, right?
That's true.
Organophosphate pesticides were found in Ms. Petrillo's stomach, right?
Yes.
Specifically, those pesticides were found in the liquid in Ms. Petrillo's stomach.
That's true.
We can go ahead and get Exhibit 10 up on the screen, Mr. Wallace. And this is a chemical breakdown of a Cara bottle of wine, right, doctor?
Yes, I believe that this test was conducted about 2 days after Ms. Petrillo's passing.
And this Cara bottle of wine test had high levels of these organophosphate pesticides inside of it, right?
Yes, however, it's very important to note that towards the bottom of this document, it does say that this empty bottle was found in a dumpster. So I have no way of telling you if it was contaminated or not and when it was contaminated.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. All I'm asking is this bottle of Cara wine had high levels of organophosphate pesticides? And the answer is yes, right?
The bottle that was found in the dumpster, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon, for your time. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. This witness can be excused.
Dr. Cannon, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. Does the defense have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor, but before calling our next witness, we'd just like to read a stipulation onto the record. Mr.
ahead.
Wood, if you could put that stipulation up for us. Your Honor, according to stipulation 17, a canister of bug-off pesticide was also found in the same dumpster in which the Rapid River Police Department found exhibits 2A and 2B, the Cara wine bottle. And with that, the defense will call our next witness.
Go ahead.
Yes, Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Austin Lewis to the stand. Before I begin, Mr. Lewis, can you see and hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good evening. My name is Austin Lewis.
Could you tell us what you do for a living?
Well, ma'am, I just so happen to be Miss Harper Martini's second in command at Peony Estates, the finest vineyard in all the Midlands. It's my job to oversee all the winemaking processes in our beautiful property.
Now, before we get to what those processes are, I want to talk about working with Miss Martini. Now, what is the breakdown of your roles at the winery?
Oh, I am living the American dream. I take care of our grapes, and Harper mostly does the fancy schmancy number stuff. I gotta be honest with you, Miss Forsyth. Last time I've done any serious math was helping my grandkiddos out in Miss Angel's class.
Well, what exactly is it like working with Miss Martini?
Oh, I'll tell you, Miss Martini is just about the finest business partner that I've had the pleasure of working with. Now, I tell everyone this, but her last name, Martini, suits her well. A fiery little cocktail, a lot to handle after a long workday, believe me. Tons of personality and alcohol, but a fine person and a fine drink.
Mr. Lewis, I just want to make sure we're all following here. When you say she's a lot to handle, what exactly do you mean by that?
Harper, how do I put it in nice legal words? She's real theatrical, like my late Aunt Judy. She could have been one of them film stars you see on the big screen, like that Maryland lady. Point being, she exaggerates a whole lot, but you get used to it after a while.
Have you ever seen Miss Martini interact with her daughter, Casey Soto?
Yes, I have. And from what I could observe, that woman loved her daughter.
Now, I'd like to talk about another facet of your experience at the winery. Do you have any role in event planning at the winery?
Oh, no, that is not my forte. But I will say that I realize that the more events we host on the vineyard, the more people come onto our property, try our wine, and fall in love with our wine.
Well, what does that mean for Peony Estates?
Well, hopefully it means that the more people are spending big bucks on our wine, and the easier it is to work with Miss Martini.
When you say it's easier to work with Miss Martini when people come and try your wine, what do you mean by that?
Well, let's just say that Harper smiles a little bit bigger when seeing the money from big events roll on in. Again, the more big events mean the more people, and the more people mean the more dimes lining our pockets.
Would weddings be considered one of those big events?
Yeah, I'd say so.
So then, Mr. Lewis, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about your winemaking processes at Peony Estates. Now, do you use chemical pesticides during your process of winemaking?
Yes, we do. And we follow all regulations when spraying our grapes and building foundations.
Have you ever seen Miss Martini use pesticides?
No, that's my job, not hers.
How exactly do you dispose of your pesticides?
Well, we throw it all in our dumpster outside the building. Now, I wouldn't trust anything you get out of that mess. We toss fertilizer, pesticide, garbage, equipment, and all sorts of nasty waste into that dumpster.
Objection, Your Honor, more prejudicial than probative. May I be heard?
You may.
Prior to trial, both parties agreed that the bottle of Cara wine marked as Exhibit 2A and 2B was found in a dumpster. And Your Honor, I have it on a good faith basis that this witness is going to insinuate that anything that would come out of that dumpster would be contaminated. It's improper for this witness to testify to such a thing and could mislead the jury.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, it's the plaintiff's contention today that a bottle of wine was contaminated before hitting that dumpster. Now, by Mr. Lewis establishing what's in that dumpster and what could be surrounding that bottle of wine that the plaintiff is alleging was contaminated, that is highly probative and does not mislead the jury in any way.
May I be heard on those grounds, Your Honor?
You may.
The witness can certainly testify as to what was in the dumpster, but the statement, "I wouldn't trust anything that came out of that dumpster," severely misleads the jury and is not testimony that should be permitted today.
Going to overrule the objection with a limiting instruction to the jury to take this witness's testimony as what he knows to be sometimes thrown in that dumpster and to make no assumptions of what was in the dumpster on that day. You can
Yes,
proceed.
Your Honor.
Mr. Lewis, I'm just going to ask you again how it is exactly that you dispose of your pesticides.
Well, we throw all of our equipment, pesticides, fertilizer, and garbage in a dumpster outside the building.
Now, Mr. Lewis, I want to talk about June 7th. Now, is there any time close to June 7th that you'll put anything in that dumpster?
Yes, ma'am. Right before the wedding rehearsal, we had just finished spraying the entire building to make sure none of the nasty critters and pests get inside. And then we threw those pesticide cans into the dumpster.
Thank you. Your Honor, we have nothing further.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
You work at the defendant's winery, Peony Estates.
Yes, ma'am.
You began using chemical pesticides at Peony Estates in 2015,
Yes, ma'am.
and you've used chemical pesticides ever since.
Yes, that's right.
Now, in 2019, you told Miss Martini, the defendant, that you needed to be more careful about how you handled your pesticides.
Yes, that's right.
And in response, Miss Martini told you that a little bit of pesticide wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, she said that.
Now, Harper is familiar with pesticides, right?
Yes, while she's never used it in our time together, she would know what pesticides are.
She knows where they're stored.
Yes, she should.
Miss Martini once told you that you can't tell when pesticides have been mixed into wine.
Yes, she said that in response to Kirby Doolittle consuming and surviving some wine, which had pesticides.
Well, she told you that you can't tell when pesticides have been mixed into wine by smell, right?
Yes,
She told you that you can't see it when pesticides have been mixed into wine, right?
yeah, that's what she said.
Miss Martini even told you that pesticides, well, they can be poisonous and fatal.
Yes, but I think any Tom, Frank, and Harry off the street could tell you that, ma'am.
All right, Mr. Lewis, I'd like to talk to you about Casey and Genesis Petrillo's wedding. Their wedding was going to be held at Peony Estates.
Yes, on June 8th.
But Genesis and Harper, they didn't get along.
I guess you could say that.
Well, Harper told you that she hated Genesis.
Yes, she did.
Objection, Your Honor. Under hearsay, may I briefly be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, in order for, excuse me, Your Honor, I'm actually going to rescind my objection.
Okay, you can proceed, counsel.
Mr. Lewis, the defendant, Harper Martini, told you that she hated Genesis.
Yes, and like I said, Harper's a drama queen, and I tend to stay out of the drama. My wife, Allie, says it's not good for my blood pressure to get involved.
Mr. Lewis, Miss Martini told you that if she could push a button and make Genesis disappear, she would.
And you know what? I normally appreciate Harper's sense of humor, but that joke just fell flat. It must be one of them generational gaps.
Mr. Lewis, I just need a yes or a no for the record. Just for clarity, Miss Martini said that if she could push a button and make Genesis disappear, she would.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Lewis, I'd like to talk about why you're testifying today. Now, you're testifying on behalf of the defense.
That's right.
Miss Martini, the defendant, she signs your paychecks.
Well, I should sure hope so.
You own 10% of Peony Estates.
Yes, and I'm proud of being a local small business co-owner.
Well, if Harper Martini loses this lawsuit, Mr. Lewis, Peony Estates would shut down.
Objection,
certainly-
Your Honor, to a lack of personal knowledge. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, whether or not Mr. Lewis knows whether or not this business would shut down after the events of this lawsuit is not within this witness's rationally based perceptions. And now foundation has been laid to show that this witness would know what would happen with the business or anything else. Therefore, this does not fall in this witness's personal knowledge and should not be included.
May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, this witness testified on direct examination that he handles a lot of what goes on at Peony Estates. And a moment ago, he just told you that he owns 10% of the business. He would certainly be aware of what would happen if something like this were to go down and the business were to lose a lawsuit.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Like opposing counsel just said, Mr. Lewis is a partial owner of this winery. Now, whether or not Miss Martini loses this lawsuit doesn't change his involvement in the winery and doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to know what's going to happen as a result, whether that be good or bad for Peony Estates. Therefore, this does not fall under his personal knowledge.
Objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, to your personal knowledge, Mr. Lewis, you believe that you would be out of a job.
Yes, but I'm close enough to retirement anyway, so it'd just be a year early.
Well, you'd be out of a lot of money, wouldn't you, Mr. Lewis?
Only the
Your
money.
Honor? Again, to a lack of personal knowledge.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
This witness just stated that he would be out of a job. Therefore, it's within his rationally based perception to ascertain whether or not he would lose a lot of money. As he just stated, he has a 10% stake in Peony Estates, and he just said that he would be out of a job. Therefore, it's reasonable for this witness to say whether or not he knows that he would be out of a lot of money. If opposing counsel wishes to redirect on that, she certainly may, but it's a matter of weight, not admissibility.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, it was just ruled that this witness does not have the personal knowledge to know what would happen in the event that Miss Martini were to lose this lawsuit. Now, while Mr. Lewis said that he may be out of a job, he doesn't necessarily know that to be fact. Neither does he know any results to be fact from this. Therefore, it's not within this witness's personal knowledge.
May I be heard briefly, Your Honor?
Briefly, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. This is cross-examination. If this witness doesn't know, he can simply say so.
I'm going to overrule the objection to the extent that it pertains to this witness losing his job. To the extent it pertains to my earlier sustained objection of the winery closing, it's sustained.
Yes,
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis, to your knowledge, you'll be out of a lot of money.
Only for this year, but thankfully, I've saved up enough money for retirement, so we'll be just fine.
Well, just to be clear, Mr. Lewis, that is the last thing that you want to happen.
Yes, absolutely. Who wants to see a small local business go under, especially in a pandemic?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that my witness be allowed to virtually step down.
Mr. Lewis, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. Does the defense have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Mr. Blair Osborne to the stand. Please introduce yourself to the court.
Yes. Sorry about that. I am Blair Osborne.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Osborne?
I am an event planner.
What does an event planner do?
That's a big question. We do a lot of things. We do weddings, we do luau's, we do bachelor parties, we do award ceremonies. I'm so sorry. I realize that's not exactly the question you were asking there. The job of a wedding planner is to take the stress that comes with planning a complicated event, such as a wedding, and to put all that stress on someone who should be able to handle that, like myself.
Could you just tell the members of the jury how you're involved in this case?
Right. This is the case about Genesis Petrillo. Genesis was going to get married, and she died before she could walk down the aisle. And I was the person who was organizing Genesis's wedding.
How long have you been planning weddings?
Oh, I've been planning weddings professionally for about 9 years now. So it might just feel like forever, but it's not. It's just 9 years of my life.
Have you ever hosted a wedding at Peony Estates?
I have. Yes, I've hosted a lot of events there. Ballpark around 80 different events at Peony Estates. That's also where I planned Genesis's wedding.
Well, I want to ask you about Genesis Petrillo's wedding specifically. Who hired you to plan that?
Harper Martini. Harper is Casey Soto's mom. So Genesis Petrillo's would-be mother-in-law. She's also the owner of Peony Estates, so we've worked together a lot in the past.
Was Miss Martini involved in planning the wedding?
Yes, absolutely. She had custom wedding favors for each of the guests. We planned out the decor together. I would get calls, lots of calls from Harper. So you could tell that she had put a lot of thought into this.
Did you ever see any conflict between Miss Martini and the couple over her involvement?
Yeah, I struggled a lot with getting the right information on stuff, and it made the whole process a lot more complicated than usual, trying to make everybody happy. Somebody hired a DJ whose initials were DJ, and I don't know how that happened. So there was a bit more crying and yelling than usual.
Mr. Osborne, let's move forward to the day of the wedding rehearsal. What was the mood at Peony Estates like that day?
Well, I was still feeling anxious. I remember I talked to Harper about how she felt. She said, I just want this day to be perfect for Casey. I just want my child to have everything exactly as they imagined.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay under 801 and 802.
Response?
Your Honor, this statement falls under an exception to hearsay under Rule 803.3. The statement from Harper Martini that she just wanted the wedding to go well for her daughter falls under that exception, as it's Miss Martini stating her intent for that wedding to go well as the mother of the bride and as the host of the wedding. Therefore, it should be admissible in trial today.
Response, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
I believe what Mr. Osborne was testifying to were Miss Martini's desires, not her intent. If Mr. Osborne had heard the defendant say, I am going to make this wedding perfect, then that would apply to Midland's Rule of Evidence 803.3. But that's not what Mr. Osborne told us. He told us that Miss Martini just wanted the wedding to go well. That's a desire, not towards the declarant's intent.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
The expression of that desire actually does fall under Rule 803.3 as an existing emotional state. If that's opposing counsel's contention in this objection, then that statement falls under 803.3 and should be admissible in trial today.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor, move to strike the offending testimony.
Mr. Osborne, how did Miss Martini and Genesis get along at the rehearsal dinner?
Well, I wish I could say I played a bigger role in keeping everybody's stress levels down, but no, it was actually Harper who took the initiative to smooth things over at dessert.
What happened during dessert?
Well, Harper presented Genesis with this gorgeous bottle of wine in front of the entire group, which made me tear up, in part because I thought it was a really sweet gesture, and in part because it meant I was another step closer to going home and getting some sleep.
Did you see if Miss Petrillo poured a glass of that wine for herself?
I did see a couple glasses poured at the table that Genesis and her friends were sitting at.
You mentioned that you saw a couple glasses. Do you know if anyone else drank from another glass?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I wasn't watching that table all night. I had to go talk to the caterers that evening, who were a whole thing that we don't have to get into right now.
Certainly not, Mr. Osborne. Did you ever see Miss Petrillo again that evening?
Yes, I did later that night by the bar. She was talking with some of her friends at the cocktail station.
Did you notice whether she had been drinking?
I never saw her actually take a drink, but she was very talkative. Slurred speech, mentioned that she had a stomach ache. So I could tell that she had been drinking.
When did Genesis leave the bar that night?
I don't know. I had been at that rehearsal dinner for ages. I left sometime around midnight. Last time I saw Genesis, it was at midnight, and Genesis was still at the bar.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. One brief moment. Good afternoon, Mr. Osborne.
Oh, good afternoon.
I can tell you're a busy guy, so we'll try to get you out of here as quickly as possible.
No problem.
I want to begin by talking about why you're here. Now, you would agree with me that the defendant, Miss Martini, is one of the main reasons why your business is so successful.
I'd say that she's one of my clients, yes.
And she's one of the main reasons why your business is so successful.
She did help my business out when it was starting out, yes.
Now, Mr. Osborne, after that relationship began, you've hosted over 80 events with the defendant.
That's right.
You've worked so much with the defendant, you consider her to be family.
Yes, we gotten pretty close.
And Mr. Osborne, when you found out that the defendant was being accused of Genesis Petrillo's death, well, you couldn't believe it.
No.
But let's be honest, Mr. Osborne, doesn't matter how much evidence I put in front of you today, nothing will ever convince you that the defendant killed Genesis.
Right. I've known Harper for a long time, and all the years that I've known her, this doesn't sound like something that Harper would do.
Well, Mr. Osborne, I want to talk about some of that evidence, specifically what happened on June 7th, 2019. Now, you'd agree with me that from what you saw, the relationship between Genesis and Harper had reached its boiling point on that day.
Right. Like I said before, the preparations for the wedding got a bit hectic, so there was a lot of fighting before the wedding.
Exactly. And on June 7th, the defendant and Genesis were still arguing.
Yes.
It got so bad that you were asked to keep the two physically separate.
That's right.
As you mentioned on direct examination, later that night, the defendant gave Genesis a bottle of wine.
Yes.
And with that wine, the defendant said, "I got this for you."
That's right. That was part of the toast.
She told Genesis that she got Genesis a special gift for her to reflect on everything she had done.
Right. That was part of the toast.
Mr. Osborne, you're pretty sure you saw Genesis drink that wine?
Yes. Well, I saw there were a couple glasses poured at the table. I didn't see Genesis drink it, though.
And just to the best of your knowledge, you didn't see anyone else drink from that bottle of car wine, did you?
No. To be fair, I wasn't watching that table all night. I had a lot going on that evening.
In less than 12 hours after the defendant gave Genesis that wine, she passed away.
That's what I've heard.
Now, Mr. Osborne, I want to take a step back and talk about a meeting that you had with the defendant less than a month before she gave Genesis that wine.
Sure.
Now, you'd agree with me that you met with the defendant in May of 2019?
Oh, yes, we've had lots of meetings preparing for that wedding.
During this meeting, the defendant, well, she played you a voicemail.
Yes.
That voicemail was from Genesis?
That's right.
In that voicemail, Genesis told the defendant that she was going to take Casey away to Paris.
Objection,
forever.
Your Honor. Under Rule 801, this is inadmissible hearsay.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes, please.
Your Honor, the contents that I'm referencing are exhibit number 8, and opposing counsel and I agreed before today's trial that exhibit number 8 would be pre-admitted.
Your Honor, so long as the statements elicited are limited to that exhibit, the plaintiff waives its objection.
Okay, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Osborne, I'll ask you again. In that voicemail, Genesis told the defendant that she was going to take Casey away to Paris forever.
Yes, that was part of the voicemail.
In that voicemail, Genesis told the defendant that she was going to die alone and no one would care.
Yes.
Mr. Osborne, the defendant, after hearing that voicemail, started screaming.
Yeah.
She barged out of the room.
Yes.
Mr. Osborne, before the defendant left, she turned to you and she said, "One of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill her."
That's right. When Genesis said those things in the voicemail, it was pretty clear to all of us in the room that Genesis was really drunk. I think all of us were pretty concerned that Genesis had been on some pretty hard liquor at the time.
Mr. Osborne, I wasn't asking you what you thought of Miss Petrilla's speech. I was just asking you that less than a month before giving Genesis that bottle of wine, the defendant told you that one of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill her.
Yes, at the pre-wedding meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Osborne, Mr. Wallace asked you about a toast that Harper gave to Genesis. Was anyone watching when Harper gave that toast?
Oh, everybody was.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Any recross based on that question, counsel?
No recross, Your Honor.
Mr. Osborne, thank you for your testimony. You are excused. Does the defense have any further witnesses?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense closes its case in chief and requests a brief 5 to 10 minute recess, depending on time, before we proceed with closing arguments.
I believe we still have time, so we will take a 5-minute recess. I'll see you all back shortly. Thank you.
Yes,
Yes, Your Honor.
Are both sides back and ready to proceed?
Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
The defense is also ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Plaintiff, you may proceed with closing arguments. Judges, please turn your computer back to speaker view so you can see counsel giving their closing. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. She plotted, she promised, and she poisoned. June 8th, 2019 was supposed to be the best day of Genesis Petrillo's life. The day before her wedding, she stared at the lace of her wedding dress. She thought about walking down the aisle, about seeing the look on Casey's face as she walked to her, surrounded by family and friends, and she was petrified. Not because she was nervous, but because she was afraid for her life. The defendant plotted, the defendant promised, and the defendant poisoned. That is why we as the plaintiff, on behalf of Genesis Petrillo's family, have brought this suit for battery. It was our job today to prove to you that it was more likely than not that the defendant intentionally mixed pesticides into Genesis Petrillo's wine, and that Genesis died as a result. Members of the jury, we have met our burden. We met our burden today by showing you that the defendant plotted. You heard that Genesis was engaged to the defendant's daughter, and that their wedding was going to be held at Peony Estates, the defendant's winery. Except the defendant didn't want Genesis to marry her daughter at all. The defendant wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone. You heard that 6 months before the wedding, the defendant told her close friend that she wanted to buy a poison made specifically for Genesis. Just a month before the wedding, the defendant said that between herself and Genesis, only one of them would make it out alive. By the time of the rehearsal dinner on June 7th of 2019, the defendant, she was fed up. So she did the only thing that she could think to do. You heard from Devin Johar, the DJ hired for Genesis and Casey's wedding, that the defendant had a plan to deal with Genesis. We met our burden today by showing you that the defendant promised. The defendant made her intentions abundantly clear. You heard from Genesis Petrillo's close friend, Angel Rodriguez, that the defendant promised Genesis she would make her disappear. Just hours later, Ms. Rodriguez witnessed the defendant carrying deadly pesticides towards the kitchen. And the defendant told Ms. Rodriguez, these are for Genesis. We met our burden today by showing that the defendant poisoned. The defendant made her plan clear from the start, and she followed through. The defendant made a special bottle of wine labeled Cara. Every other guest at the dinner received a completely different bottle, and every other guest survived the night. No one else drank from that bottle, and Genesis ended up in the emergency room. While Genesis lay dying in a hospital bed, the defendant snuck into her room. She found that empty bottle of wine, and she got rid of it in a dumpster, hoping that no one would find it. The defendant even wore gloves as she disposed of that bottle because she knew how dangerous it truly was. You heard from Dr. Kwan that Genesis died because of an organophosphate pesticide found in her wine. Pesticide the defendant knew Genesis wouldn't be able to see or smell. Pesticide the defendant used to poison Genesis. She plotted, she promised, and she poisoned. Members of the jury, Genesis is gone. She's gone. And instead of taking her death seriously, the defense has turned to an excuse that the evidence simply doesn't support. The defense would have you believe that Genesis could have died of alcohol poisoning or any other cause under the moon, but members of the jury, their own expert, took this stand today And she told you that the most likely cause of death in this case is pesticide poisoning. The defendant wanted Genesis out of her life, and she was determined to see her intentions through. No matter what the defense tries to tell you, members of the jury, remember the defendant's own words. I need you out of our lives. Leave, Casey, otherwise I will take you out of the picture the hard way. You have till the 7th. Members of the jury, the defendant told Genesis she had until the 7th to leave Casey. Genesis refused and she was dead on the 8th. Genesis died in a hospital bed hours before her wedding. Because the defendant killed her. Because the defendant plotted. She promised and she poisoned. Find her liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Closing argument for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, can you see and hear me all right?
I can, thank you.
May it please the court. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. We're all here looking for answers. Just like the plaintiff counsel, we're here seeking justice too, because no one in this virtual courtroom today is going to deny that what happened to Miss Petrillo was an absolute tragedy. And in moments of absolute tragedy, it's natural to ask why, to assign blame, to want answers. But you heard today, time after time after time again today, the answer to so many crucial questions was, I don't know. I didn't see that. I wasn't there. Members of the jury, what we need here today in order to assign blame is answers. Now, when the plaintiff walked into this virtual courtroom today, they took on a burden. They had to prove to you, one, that Miss Martini acted with intent to harm Miss Petrillo. Two, that she acted on that intent and poisoned that bottle of wine. And three, that Miss Petrillo died as a result of consuming that poisoned wine. They had to prove that to you to be more likely than not. But when we don't have answers, how do we even know what's likely in the first place? But the plaintiff will have you believe that it's as easy as saying she plotted, she promised, and she poisoned. It's catchy, it's convenient, but it doesn't give us the answers that we need for Miss Petrillo to have justice. So let's walk through those three things one at a time and figure out what exactly it is that we do and do not know. Let's start with that first thing. Did Miss Martini have the intent to kill Miss Petrillo? The answer is, members of the jury, we don't know. Because we've heard so many reasons today for Miss Martini not to. Miss Martini would be killing her daughter's love of her life. You heard from Austin Lewis today, the head winemaker at Peony Estates, that weddings like these are huge for revenue and huge for exposure to the business. By killing Miss Petrillo, she'd be risking her own business. Not only that, members of the jury, but we have to ask ourselves, why would Miss Martini give this bottle of supposedly poisoned wine directly to Miss Petrillo, a direct handoff, in front of the entire wedding party? During the speeches, everyone's eyes on her. You heard Blair Osborne and you heard the DJ from that night. There was no hiding that bottle. members of the jury, we know that you saw some pretty worrisome statements here today. And I'm not here to tell you that Miss Martini is perfect. I'm not here to tell you that Miss Martini even liked Miss Petrillo. But we do know that in moments of intense frustration or anger, sometimes we say things we don't necessarily mean. But that doesn't mean that we acted on it. Miss Martini didn't plot to kill Genesis Petrillo, and that brings us into our second point. She didn't promise it either. Because not a single eyewitness came before you today, not a single photograph was presented to you, no camera footage, and no forensic evidence to show you that Miss Martini actually poisoned that bottle of wine. When the DJ went into the bottling room, when the plaintiff alleges it happens, she went in there twice. Right before Miss Martini was in there and when Miss Martini entered that room again. And not once did she see a single canister of pesticides anywhere in that room. No one can tell you that she poisoned that bottle. But the plaintiff will have you believe because a bottle of wine was tested in a dumpster that came positive for pesticides, that's it. That bottle was poisoned and Miss Martini did it. But members of the jury, if we pull up that report here today, you'll see that at the bottom of that report, it says that that bottle was empty. There was no wine in that bottle to be tested. So what do we know about that bottle? We know that it was surrounded by pesticide containers because Mr. Lewis came before you today and told you that just days before June 7th, they discarded all of the pesticides that they had used for an earlier spraying in that same exact dumpster. Miss Martini didn't stop anyone from drinking that bottle of wine. She didn't stop the DJ. She left that bottle on a table. She walked right away. She wasn't guarding it. She wasn't protecting it because there wasn't poison in it, members of the jury, which leads us to that third element of harm. We don't know what caused Miss Petrillo's death, and we don't know because the treating physician at the hospital, Dr. Kwan, ran one test under one assumption and produced one result. Dr. Cannon, a leading toxicologist in the field, came up here today and told you that Dr. Kwan couldn't even provide us with a level of pesticides in Miss Petrillo's system. She couldn't even tell us what a lethal level of pesticides was, but what she could tell you, and what we do know, members of the jury, is that people survive after drinking small amounts of pesticide, whether or not that was in the bottle. But she'd have you believe that showing you 3 symptoms on a chart is enough, that that's it. But Dr. Cannon came up here today and told you that those 3 symptoms can be explained by many other things if they're corroborated. But Dr. Kwan didn't look at medical records, didn't run more than one test because she wanted one conclusion, and that's what she found. We need answers for justice. We don't know, and that's why you must find Harper Martini not liable for battery. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff, is there any rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Members of the jury, let's talk about what we know. We know the defendant told Genesis to leave Casey or to be taken out the hard way. We know that the defendant's expert took the stand today and told us that the most likely cause of death for Genesis, well, that was pesticide poisoning. And we know that the defendant said for months what she was going to do. The day before the wedding, the defendant stood with pesticides, deadly pesticides in her hands, and she promised, these are for Genesis. And that is exactly what she did with those pesticides. Because the defendant plotted, the defendant promised, and the defendant poisoned. Find Harper Martini liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. This case has been submitted to the jury. For all of the competitors,